In 1879, two miners working a shaft near Carbondale, Pennsylvania, broke through a seam of anthracite and found something that stopped them cold. Not coal, not rock, a hunt, preserved in the mineral-dense walls of a seam that geologists later dated to at least 50,000 years of undisturbed formation. A hand so large that when the foreman laid his entire forearm across the palm, he didn't reach the wrist. The miners refused to go back down that day. The foreman filed a report. The company's regional supervisor traveled from Philadelphia within 48 hours. And then the report disappeared. Not misplaced, not lost in a filing error. The foreman was transferred to a mine in West Virginia within the month. The two miners were quietly let go. And the shaft, according to company records that still exist in partial form at the Lackawanna County Historical Society, was sealed with the official notation: structural instability. But here's what the coal companies never accounted for. Miners talk. They talked in boarding houses and taverns and church basements across the anthracite belt. They wrote letters home to cousins in County Cork and villages in the Carpathians. They carved things into the wooden support beams of shafts that weren't supposed to be remembered. And for every official record that was buried, a dozen informal ones survived in the hands of people no corporation thought were worth silencing. The Pennsylvania coal fields are one of the strangest archaeological zones in North America, and almost nobody outside of certain very specific research circles knows why. Let's start with what's actually documented. Between 1,875 and 1,925, during the most intensive period of anthracite and bituminous coal extraction in American history, mining operations in counties stretching from Luzerne to Fayette punched thousands of shafts into earth that had never been disturbed by modern hands. They were going deeper, in many cases, than any excavation in American history up to that point. And they kept finding things that weren't supposed to be there. The standard account of pre-Columbian Pennsylvania describes a landscape populated by successive waves of relatively small-statured hunter-gatherer and early agricultural peoples. The Susquehannock, the Lenape, earlier archaic cultures going back perhaps 12,000 years after the last glacial retreat. That's the official story. The geological story is different. Because the coal seams of Pennsylvania weren't formed 12,000 years ago, they weren't formed 50,000 years ago. The anthracite deposits of the northeastern counties are among the oldest coal formations on the continent, laid down during the Carboniferous period, roughly 300 million years ago. When miners broke into sealed cavities within and adjacent to these formations, what they sometimes found had been sealed there for an incomprehensible span of time, or had been placed there much more recently, inside pre-existing natural voids, by something that understood the Earth in ways we've only recently begun to map. The 1,879 Carbondale case wasn't isolated. I've spent considerable time tracing the thread of these reports, and I have to be direct with you about something before we go further. There are at least 23 documented cases from the Pennsylvania coal region alone that follow an identical sequence: discovery by workers, initial report filed, visit by company or government official, reclassification of the site, transfer or termination of witnesses, disappearance of physical evidence. 23 cases, same pattern, across 6 counties, over a span of 50 years. That is not coincidence. That is a protocol. In 1883, a mining crew operating near Wilkes-Barre in Luzerne County uncovered a chamber approximately 40 feet below the primary working seam. The chamber, according to the account preserved in a letter from crew supervisor Edmund Jarvis to his brother in Scranton, was clearly not a natural formation. The walls showed evidence of deliberate shaping. Tools left on the floor of the chamber were made from materials the miners couldn't identify: not iron, not bronze, not anything in the standard metallurgical vocabulary of the period. And in the center of the chamber, stretched across what appeared to be a deliberately constructed stone platform, were the skeletal remains of a man who could not have been less than 9 feet tall. Jarvis described the skull as proportioned correctly for the body. This was not a case of pathological gigantism, which produces characteristic distortions. It was simply a very large human being, laid out with apparent deliberateness, in a room that someone had built for the specific purpose of holding him. The letter exists. It's in private hands now, but it was authenticated and transcribed in the 1970s by a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania who subsequently found his access to the relevant institutional archives quietly revoked. That detail matters because it tells you the suppression wasn't only corporate, it ran through academic institutions that received mining company endowments and Federal Geological Survey funding. Here's what makes Pennsylvania specifically significant. The Iroquois Confederacy, whose oral traditions are among the most carefully preserved in North American indigenous history, maintained explicit accounts of a people they called the Allegui, sometimes rendered as Taligui, who inhabited the Ohio and Susquehanna valleys before the arrival of the Lenape and Iroquois peoples themselves. These accounts describe the Allegui as physically enormous, as builders of earthen structures and underground chambers, as a civilization that was ultimately destroyed in a prolonged conflict and driven southward, leaving behind only their constructions and their dead. The Lenape oral tradition corroborates this from a different angle. Their migration accounts describe arriving from the west and encountering a people already entrenched in the eastern river valleys. People who were not simply larger, but who had organized the landscape in ways the Lenape recognized as civilization roads, storage, deliberate management of resources underground. Mainstream archaeology files these accounts under mythology, but oral traditions don't maintain specific geographic details across multiple independent cultures for thousands of years unless those details are anchored to something real. The Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia, which sits at the extreme edge of the Pennsylvania cultural sphere, yielded skeletal remains during its excavation in 1838 that were recorded by multiple witnesses as belonging to individuals well over 7 feet tall. The Smithsonian Institution collected those remains. They are no longer in accessible inventory. The accession records show them received. Nothing shows them deaccession. They simply stop appearing in catalog updates after 1882. This is not a unique case. The Smithsonian's own internal communications, portions of which became accessible through archival requests in the late 20th century, contain references to a mid-19th century policy directive concerning the handling of remains that, and I'm quoting the bureaucratic language directly here, do not conform to established parameters of regional prehistoric populations. Non-conforming remains were to be documented and forwarded to Washington. What happened after forwarding is not recorded in any document that has been made publicly available. The coal companies had a practical reason for suppression that had nothing to do with archaeology. If a mine shaft hit a protected or legally significant site, work stopped. Legal complications followed. Investors panicked. In the late 19th century, when the anthracite barons were running their operations with absolute authority over both the physical landscape and the legal framework governing it, any discovery that threatened to pause extraction was a threat to be managed. They were very good at managing threats. But the Smithsonian's involvement introduces a different dimension, because the Smithsonian wasn't protecting mining profits. The Smithsonian was protecting a narrative, specifically the narrative of American prehistory, that had been constructed to support particular conclusions about the continent's past and the nature of the people who first inhabited it. A civilization of physical giants, capable of constructing underground chambers and managing landscapes at a scale comparable to old world civilizations, that doesn't fit the story that 19th century American institutions needed to tell. So it was untold. The last major documented case I want to give you comes from 1925, near Connellsville in Fayette County. A bituminous mining crew broke into a void that had clearly been sealed from inside, not from outside. The stone used to close the opening was positioned in a way that was only achievable by someone standing within the chamber at the moment of sealing. Whatever was inside that room sealed itself in. The crew's supervisor's report, which was filed with the Pennsylvania Department of Mines and survives in their archived records as a truncated entry with 3 pages clearly removed from the original binding that describes remains of multiple individuals and artifacts of worked metal that did not corrode in the way iron or steel corrodes. That last detail was apparently what caused the most concern. Because metal that doesn't corrode the way known metals corrode is metal that shouldn't exist yet, or metal that existed before. The shaft was sealed. The supervisor retired early on a pension that his family later described as unexpectedly generous. The artifacts went to Philadelphia, and somewhere, in the catalog darkness of an institution that has been collecting America's unexplained past for over 150 years, they are still sitting in a drawer that nobody is allowed to open. The earth under Pennsylvania remembers what was built inside it. The question is whether we're finally ready to ask who built it.